Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a chilly autumn night when the unsettling feeling first crept into Sarah's mind. She had always enjoyed the quiet solitude of her small cottage on the outskirts of town, the kind of peaceful retreat where you could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. It was a far cry from the noise and clutter of the city, and Sarah had grown to love it over the years. But tonight, something was different. She had been at home alone for a few days, as her roommates had gone on a weekend trip. The house was still, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sarah settled on the couch with a cup of tea, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. The warmth from the mug in her hands contrasted with the cold, damp air outside, and she tried to focus on the comfort of the moment, ignoring the growing unease in her gut. It started with the knocking. It was faint at first, almost as if it was just the wind. But the knocks came again, more insistent this time, coming from somewhere near the back door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who would be knocking at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and the house was miles away from the nearest neighbor. Her first thought was that it could be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But the knocks sounded too deliberate. She stood up, trying to shake the chill creeping down her spine, and made her way cautiously to the door. With every step, the knocking grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't coming from the back door, but from the window just beside it. She froze, staring out the window into the pitch-black night. There was no one there, just the emptiness of the surrounding forest. But then she heard it again, a faint scraping sound, followed by another knock. Her blood ran cold. She backed away from the window and called out, "Hello? Who's there?" There was no answer. Her breath quickened, the silence in the house pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her chest. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. But then, silence. No knocking, no scraping, just the heavy stillness of the night. But Sarah didn't feel safe anymore. The strange knocking continued on and off for hours, as never in a pattern she could predict. Sometimes it would come from one window, then the next, then from the front door. There was no way of telling where it was coming from next. Eventually, fatigue set in, and she tried to ignore the feeling of dread that had taken over. She locked all the windows and doors, drawing the curtains tight as though that would protect her. But as she lay in bed, her mind wouldn't quiet. She thought she heard faint whispers, too low to decipher, but growing louder by the second. They seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the walls, an eerie rustling noise that sent waves of panic through her. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Let me in! Let me in!" The words were unmistakable now, carried on the cold breath of the wind. She bolted out of bed, heart racing, convinced someone was in the house. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. Then the house went quiet. She hesitated before opening the door. The sound of her pulse was deafening in the silence. She slowly pushed it open, stepping into the dark hallway. Her eyes scanned the room, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. Everything appeared as it should be, except for one thing. The door to the basement was ajar. The whisper started again, soft like a low murmur coming from the dark space below. She had never been down there, and she wasn't about to start now, but the voice kept beckoning, pulling her toward the basement. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from one of her roommates. "We just got back. Why does it say we missed a call from you? Are you okay?" It was a call she had never made. Panic surged through her body, and she ran to the front door, throwing it open with every ounce of strength she had. She didn't look back as she sprinted into the woods, the sounds of the whispers still echoing in her mind. She never returned to the cottage, and to this day, no one knows what exactly happened that night. The cottage remains abandoned, the windows still dark, the doors locked tight. The knocking? It never stopped. The whispers? They can still be heard if you stand near the house late at night. Some say it's the wind, others say it's something worse, something that's still waiting inside.
Story number 2.
It had been a long day, and Mark was looking forward to a quiet evening at his apartment. He had recently moved into a building on the edge of the city, an old structure with creaky floors and narrow hallways. It was cheap, which was perfect for someone just starting out, but it had a strange feeling to it, an oppressive silence that seemed to cling to the walls, like the place itself was holding its breath. Mark hadn't given it much thought at first, but tonight it felt different. As he sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, the lights flickered. Not just once, but a few times in quick succession, as though something was messing with the power. He tried to brush it off as a faulty connection, but the uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't subside. He got up to check the fuse box, but when he walked down the dim hallway to the kitchen, he noticed something strange. A door that had always been locked, one he never used, was slightly ajar. He hadn't opened it, not in the weeks he'd lived there. In fact, he had assumed the door led to an old utility closet or storage area, but it wasn't supposed to open. His landlord had given him a warning about it, said it hadn't been used in years and was likely too dangerous to access. But there it was, standing open just a crack. Mark hesitated, his mind racing. The apartment had always felt odd, but he'd attributed it to the age of the building, to the strange noises the pipes made at night. But now, with that door open, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that had been waiting, perhaps for him, to unlock it. Against his better judgment, he slowly approached the door. He reached out, hand trembling, and pushed it open just enough to peek inside. It was pitch dark beyond the threshold, the air colder than it should have been for the time of year. He felt a strange pull, like something in the room beyond was calling to him. He stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. His breath hitched in panic. He scrambled for his phone, flicking on the flashlight, but the light barely illuminated the room. The walls were covered in what looked like old wallpaper, peeling and discolored, but the oddest thing was the smell. It wasn't a typical musty scent. It was a sharp, metallic odor, like rust or blood. As Mark's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized the room was filled with old furniture, some covered in dust and cobwebs, others left in a state of disarray. But the worst part was what lay in the center of the room. A large mirror, cracked in several places, reflecting nothing but the dim light from his phone. A cold chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong with that mirror. It didn't feel like a normal reflection. His own face in the glass seemed off. His features were distorted, and the reflection flickered as though it didn't belong there. His heartbeat quickened, and he tried to step back, but the air felt heavy, pressing against him, making it hard to move. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. It wasn't just him anymore. A shadowy figure appeared behind him, its outline dark and formless. Mark spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. He whirled back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming more defined, long, thin limbs, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Mark gasped, taking a step back, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The air grew colder, and the metallic scent became overwhelming, like the smell of something rotten. The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and Mark's body went rigid with fear. It was smiling at him, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something far worse, something hungry. Without thinking, Mark ran. He pushed through the door, slamming it open and stumbling back into the hallway. His phone's flashlight flickered, almost going out completely, but he didn't stop. He ran down the narrow hall, not daring to look back until he reached the front door. He yanked it open, not bothering to lock it behind him. It wasn't until he was out on the street, gasping for air, that he dared to turn around. His apartment building loomed in the distance, silent, dark. Nothing had changed, but the feeling of dread was thick in the air, like the building itself was watching him. He didn't go back that night, and he never did again. A few days later, Mark tried to call his landlord, but the number had changed. The building had been listed as unavailable, no longer accepting new tenants. He drove by, but when he looked up at the windows of the old building, he saw nothing but darkness. No lights, no movement, just the cold emptiness. Some say that room, that mirror, still exists in the building, waiting for someone else to unlock the door. And when they do, the reflection will be waiting for them too.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Emma and her friends had rented a cabin in the woods to escape the stress of work and life. The cabin was secluded, nestled deep within a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. The perfect place for peace and relaxation. On the first night, everything seemed perfect. They gathered around a crackling fire outside, laughing, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly, filling the night with a serene beauty. Emma was enjoying the peace and quiet, away from the noise of the city, when she noticed something strange, a faint light in the distance, just past the tree line. At first, she thought it was a car's headlights, but there was no road nearby, and the light seemed to be moving, swaying gently from side to side. She mentioned it to her friends, but they brushed it off as nothing more than a trick of the light, maybe from the moon or some animal. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Emma lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. The house was completely silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the wind howling outside. But then she heard it, a soft thumping sound, coming from somewhere in the house. At first, it was faint, like the sound of footsteps moving around. But it grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking around in the dark. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Her heart began to race as she sat up in bed, straining to listen. The thumping continued, now right outside her door. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, ready to call one of her friends, but the light on her phone flickered and went out. The thumping stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was deafening. But then there was a sound, a soft, wet scrape, like something dragging across the floor. She slowly got out of bed, her legs weak with fear, and crept toward the door. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of what could be happening. She could feel her pulse in her throat as she reached for the door handle and slowly turned it. Just as she was about to open it, she heard a whisper, too soft to understand, but it sent a chill straight down her spine. It came from the hallway. Emma? Her blood ran cold. It sounded like her name, but it wasn't her friend's. It was deeper, raspy and unsettling, like something that shouldn't be in the house. She didn't open the door. She stood frozen, holding her breath, praying she hadn't been heard. The whisper came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor, dragging itself along the hallway. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could feel her stomach twisting with fear. There was no way she was going out there. Not with whatever that was. Then suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. She stood in the dark, barely able to breathe, waiting for any sign of movement. She was about to call out to her friends when the door handle rattled. It was a gentle shake at first, then more forceful, as if someone or something on the other side was trying to get in. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the dark room looking for something to defend herself with. The door shook harder, and a voice, low and guttural, growled from the other side. "Let me in, Emma." The voice was like gravel scraping against stone, and it sent a wave of terror through her. She backed into the corner, heart racing, eyes wide with panic. The handle rattled again, and this time, the door started to creak open, just a few inches, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. The scraping sound began again, but this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside her room. She whipped around, eyes scanning the dark space, but there was nothing there. Just the cold emptiness, the stillness. She was about to scream, but before the sound could escape, the lights flickered back on, blinding her for a moment. When her vision cleared, the room was empty. The door was closed. The thumping had stopped. Emma stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She bolted out of her room and ran down the hall to her friends' rooms, pounding on the doors, waking them up. But when they opened the doors, they were confused, saying they hadn't heard anything. No thumping, no whispers, no dragging sounds. They'd all been asleep. The next morning, the group decided to leave the cabin early. Emma didn't want to stay another minute in that place. As they packed up their things, She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She glanced at the tree line one last time, but the strange light was gone. When they left, Emma took one last look at the cabin as they drove away. But as the car pulled further down the road, she saw something in the window. A face. Pale, hollow eyes staring out at her from the dark cabin. It wasn't one of her friends, and it wasn't anyone she recognized. Some say the cabin is still out there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. And if you're unlucky enough to wander too close at night, you might hear the soft scraping sound of something or someone coming for you.
Story number 4.
It was a late summer night when Claire first moved into the old apartment building on Maple Street. The building had always been a little rundown, but she had been desperate for a place to stay, and the price was right. The apartment itself was small, with creaky floors and chipped paint, but it had an odd charm, like a place that had stories to tell if you listened closely enough. But there was one thing that bothered her about it from the start: the mirrors. Every room, from the living room to the bedroom and even the bathroom, had a mirror. Most were small, framed in cheap wood, but the one in the hallway was different. It was large, almost floor to ceiling, with an ornate, tarnished silver frame. Claire couldn't explain why, but every time she walked past it, she felt uneasy. It was as though the mirror was watching her, studying her, waiting for something. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, she had her hands full with unpacking, getting used to the new place, and starting her new job. But then things started to happen. It began with small noises in the middle of the night. Scratching sounds, faint tapping, like someone was gently tapping on the wall or the floor, just out of reach. She chalked it up to old pipes, the building settling, or maybe even the wind outside. But the sounds grew more distinct, more purposeful, like they were coming closer. One night, she was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when she heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the hallway, right outside her bedroom door. She froze, her heart beating faster as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Claire tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. It had to be. But then the sound stopped, and then she heard something else, a low, soft whisper. Claire, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone else in the building, and no one had visited her. She hesitated, not sure whether to open the door or to stay in the safety of her room. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it sounded almost familiar, as though someone she knew was standing just outside her door, calling her name in the dark. She mustered the courage to open the door, but when she stepped into the hallway, the apartment was silent. No tapping, no whispering, nothing. Just the oppressive stillness of the old building. But the moment she looked toward the mirror in the hallway, her blood ran cold. The reflection in the mirror was not hers. Standing there, staring back at her with a chilling expression, was a woman, a stranger, with pale skin, hollow eyes, and a wide, unnatural grin. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled back, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at her with a terrifying, almost mocking expression. Claire slammed the door shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. What had she seen? Who was that woman in the mirror? She thought about calling someone, but who would believe her? It was just a trick of the light, right? Or maybe she was just overtired from moving in. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and dread. But no matter how hard she tried, Claire couldn't shake the image of the woman from the mirror. She avoided the hallway whenever she could, but it was impossible to ignore it completely. Each time she passed it, the reflection seemed to stare at her, watching her every move. Then one evening, after a particularly long day at work, Claire came home to find something even more disturbing. The door to her bedroom was wide open, though she was certain she had closed it before leaving. And standing in the hallway, in front of the mirror, was the same woman. This time, however, she wasn't grinning. She was smiling, but it was different. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips, like she was enjoying something dark and twisted. The woman's eyes followed Claire as she approached, and Claire froze in place, unable to tear her gaze away from the mirror. Suddenly, the reflection began to move. The woman in the mirror stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward the glass. Claire's blood ran cold as the woman's fingers pressed against the surface of the mirror, and the glass rippled like water, distorting the reflection. "Claire," the whisper came again, but this time it was not from outside. It came from within the mirror, inside the room, inside her very own mind. Claire screamed and backed away, but the woman in the mirror didn't stop. She stepped closer, her face inching toward the glass, her eyes fixed on Claire. With all the strength she had, Claire ran out of the apartment, not stopping until she reached the street. The night air was cool, but her skin was slick with sweat, her heart racing. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to leave. She couldn't stay there. Not with that thing in the mirror, not with that woman who was waiting for her. The next morning, Claire called the landlord, demanding to move out. The landlord was confused but agreed to let her go. When Claire returned to collect her things, the apartment was empty. No strange whispers, no tapping, no eerie reflection. But when she reached the hallway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mirror was gone, completely removed, the wall where it had once stood bare, like it had never been there. To this day, Claire never fully understood what happened in that apartment. She left Maple Street and moved far away, hoping to leave it all behind. But sometimes in the quietest moments, when she's alone in a room with a mirror, she still feels that creeping sensation, like someone is watching her from the other side. And sometimes when she looks closely, she could swear she sees a faint reflection of a woman with hollow eyes, waiting.
Story number 5.
It had been a long day for Emma, and she was grateful to be home. The city was always bustling, always busy, but tonight the streets felt strangely empty. She had recently moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, in a quiet neighborhood with old brick houses and large trees that seemed to loom in the dusk. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. But it was what Emma needed after years of chaos in the city. Her apartment was on the second floor of a converted house, and though the building was old, it had its charm. The landlord, a friendly but somewhat odd man named Mr. Caldwell, had mentioned that the building had been here for over a century. He hadn't said much more about its history, and Emma didn't press him for details. She wasn't the type to get caught up in spooky stories, and anyway, the apartment had a certain warmth to it, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight. That night, after dinner, Emma settled in with a cup of tea and turned on the TV. It was a routine she had come to enjoy, and the noise of the television helped calm her nerves. The apartment was quiet, too quiet sometimes, and she wasn't sure why, but she always felt like she wasn't completely alone. Around midnight, she heard a soft sound, just a rustle, like fabric brushing against fabric. It came from the hallway, just outside her door. She froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual creaks of the old building. This was different. Curious but reluctant, Emma got up from the couch and cautiously made her way to the door. She opened it slightly, peeking into the darkened hallway. At first, there was nothing, just the dim glow of a streetlight filtering in from the window at the end of the hall. But then she saw it, a shadow, a figure, barely distinguishable, standing near the far wall. It was still, too still. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She was certain no one else lived on this floor. Mr. Caldwell had assured her of that. And yet, there it was. The figure seemed to sway slightly as though it were caught in a draft, but there was no breeze. Emma stood frozen, not sure whether to call out or retreat into her apartment and lock the door. But before she could make a decision, the figure moved. Slowly at first, then faster, coming straight toward her. Terrified, Emma slammed the door shut and locked it. Her pulse was racing as she backed away, her breath shallow. What had she seen? Who was it? She considered calling the landlord, but what would she say? She had no explanation for what she just witnessed. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But that didn't stop her from double-checking the locks on every door and window before she crawled into bed. She left the lights on, something she never did, and tried to fall asleep, but the events of the night lingered in her mind. The next morning, Emma woke to an unsettling silence. The apartment was still and quiet, as it always was in the early hours before the world outside began to stir, but something felt off. She got dressed and went to the kitchen to make some coffee, trying to shake off the lingering feeling that something wasn't right. As she passed by the hallway mirror, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the reflection, she saw the same figure from last night, standing just behind her, staring at her. The face was a blur, indistinguishable, but the outline was unmistakable. The figure wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was in the reflection, in the mirror, right next to her. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Her mind raced. Could it be a trick of the light? But how could she have seen it in the reflection? And why had it been so close? Emma tried to shake off the panic creeping up her spine, but it lingered. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the house itself was hiding something. The walls seemed to close in on her as she walked through the apartment, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty spaces. The next few days were no better. She would wake up to strange noises in the night, whispers, soft and distant, like voices coming from the walls themselves. The lights flickered intermittently, and at times she could swear she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a figure that wasn't there when she looked directly at it. On the third night, it happened again. The figure returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. Emma was sitting in her living room, trying to focus on her work when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. She jumped, her breath hitching in her throat. Slowly, she stood up and moved toward the door. She peeked through the peephole and saw nothing. But when she turned back to her apartment, her eyes fell on the mirror by the couch. There, in the reflection, stood the figure. Its face was clearer now, a ghostly, hollow visage, pale, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to stare right into her soul. Its mouth opened, as though it were speaking, but no sound came out. The figure slowly raised a hand, its long, bony fingers reaching toward her. Panic surged through her body, and before she could react, the figure moved closer, stepping out of the mirror and into the room. Emma screamed, stumbling backward, but the figure didn't move, its eyes fixed on her as though it was waiting for her to do something, anything. That was when Emma realized it was waiting for her to invite it in. Terrified, she backed into the corner of the room. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her gaze from the figure in the mirror, now standing right in front of her. The air grew cold, heavy, as though the house itself were alive, breathing with the figure. "Let me stay," the figure whispered in a voice that was soft, almost pleading. "Just a little longer." Without thinking, Emma bolted toward the door and ran down the stairs, not stopping until she reached the street. She didn't look back. The next day, Emma moved out of the apartment, leaving behind all of her belongings. She never told anyone what happened, what she had seen. The landlord never asked either. But some nights, when she's alone, she can still feel that cold presence in the corner of her eye, the whispering voices following her, waiting for her to let them in. And no matter where she goes, she can never quite shake the feeling that the figure is still waiting, just beyond the mirror.
Story number 6.
It was the kind of summer evening that made you forget the passing of time. Warm, golden light poured through the trees in the backyard of the old house, casting long shadows across the lawn. Alice, a young woman who had just moved into the house, sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The house was older, built in the late 1800s, but it had character, and the price had been right. A little work here and there, and it would be perfect. She was used to solitude, so the quiet was comforting. But there was something odd about the house, something that gnawed at the back of her mind. The neighbors were distant, hardly ever around, and there was always a strange, heavy silence hanging in the air at night. The kind of silence that pressed against your chest when you tried to sleep, the kind that made you wonder if something was out there, watching. It wasn't until the third night that Alice started to notice it. Subtle at first, but then growing more pronounced. Strange noises, scraping sounds in the walls, faint whispers drifting through the cracks in the floorboards. At first, she chalked it up to the house settling, an old structure groaning under its own weight. But the more she heard, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the house that was making the noise. One night, she sat in her bedroom reading a book when she heard a soft scraping sound coming from the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was the wind pushing something against the wall. But then the sound came again, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of something dragging across the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to dismiss it, to convince herself it was just her imagination running wild. But as the minutes ticked by, the noises grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just the house settling. It was something, someone. Alice stood up slowly, her pulse quickening, and walked toward the corner of the room where the sound was coming from. She hesitated for a moment, trying to steady her breath. There was no way she was going to let her imagination get the best of her. But when she reached the corner, she froze. The floorboards were scraped and scratched, as though something had been dragged across them repeatedly. She knelt down to get a closer look, her fingers brushing against the wood. That's when she noticed the faint, irregular marks, like something had been clawing at the floor. And then, just as she was about to pull away, she heard it, a whisper, right next to her ear. "Help me." The voice was soft, barely a breath, but it sent a jolt of terror through her body. She whipped around, but the room was empty. The air was thick, suffocating, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she tried to steady her breath. The whispers grew louder, this time coming from all directions, echoing in the corners of the room. They were indistinct at first, but soon they began to form words, pleading, desperate words. "Help me. Let me out." Alice's heart pounded in her chest. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, and she could see her breath in the cold air. She wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, and her body refused to obey. The whispers continued, growing more frantic. "Help me. You have to help me." With shaking hands, Alice grabbed her phone and called the landlord, but there was no answer. She tried again, and still there was no response. Panicked, she turned toward the door, but the whispers followed her, echoing louder until they filled the room. "Help me, please." Then, in a flash, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Alice fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. The beam of light flickered as well, and in the brief flashes of darkness, she saw something she would never forget. A figure, pale, thin, and almost transparent, was standing at the foot of her bed. Its face was twisted in agony, eyes hollow and empty, and its mouth was stretched in a silent scream. She gasped, stumbling back against the wall. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, like it was slowly inching closer to her. "Help me." The voice was not coming from the figure, but from all around her. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. The cold air intensified, and Alice could feel the presence pressing in on her from all sides, like the walls themselves were alive and watching. Suddenly, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. It glided across the floor toward her, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though it was being dragged by some unseen force. Alice backed into the corner, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stopped just in front of her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. It opened its mouth wide as though it were going to speak, but instead, a terrible sound filled the room, a low, guttural growl that rattled her bones. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the sound of her own frantic breathing. The whispers stopped. The room was silent once more, but the air remained cold and heavy. Alice stood frozen in the corner, unable to move. The house felt different now, as though it had become a living, breathing entity, watching her from every corner. She didn't know what the figure wanted, or why it had chosen her, but one thing was clear. The house was not empty. It was never empty. For weeks after that night, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting. No matter how many lights she turned on, no matter how many times she checked every corner of the house, she couldn't escape the presence that had taken root inside. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the house was still and quiet, she would hear the whisper again. "Help me. Let me out." Alice moved out shortly after, but no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was always just behind her, following her in the dark. The house on the hill, with its peeling paint and empty windows, still stood there, waiting for its next tenant. And the whispers, those soft, pleading whispers, never stopped.